Now with the semester being a little bit different, I thought it would be good for us to go through this particular slideshow, and then be able to rehearse again some of the things that we've been through this semester. So again, some of these things thematically will show up in our final, and asking the question. And again, I'll let you guys know exactly what it is when we put some things together. I'm working with the other professors to put that together, specifically like Dr. Magianis, Lucy Sanders, and Orleana Thompson. So we're working on some of those things to be able to figure out for the final. So yeah, just keep checking your emails. I promise I usually don't, but especially not with the final and the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I'm not going to catch you guys off guard, or not going to throw you guys for a loop. So yeah, likely one question, short essay, and then that'll be that for the final. So so as we go through these themes again, um, just to keep in mind some of the stuff we've talked about throughout the semester, and hopefully with our increased learning, increased understanding, some of these things won't seem as new as when we first visited them. So specifically for Kayla, like, so if you go over to Moodle week 1, you'll find under one of the presentations for week 2, or no, week 1 presentation 2, I'm sorry, it'll look similar to this. Literary structure of the Pentateuch. So again, Moodle, week 1, presentation 2. And so go ahead and go over to the first slide. We'll say Genesis and then zoom in for that. We talked about with Genesis being a book of beginnings, this kind of primeval world history. And what this is, and let me go ahead and load this real quick. Kind of the way Israel tells its early history, specifically starting with the very beginning, which is the beginning of the entire world in its creative form. And so zoom in, and so if you go over again, you'll see Genesis 1 through 11. This one right here, and you'll see it there. So you have that primeval world history that's a modified version of the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Egypt creation stories. And we had talked some about throughout the semester, specifically in regards to creation stories. And you guys will remember from your cultures class that different cultures have different creation stories. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that Israel just took a story from Egypt or just took a story from the Mesopotamians, adopted it as their own, and just kind of peeled off some layers and made it like, oh, it's ours now. They stole someone's homework and just changed the name. And that's not what Israel does. What they do, again, they're immersed within cultures, so they have similarities within cultures. But at the same time, we talked through in this semester how there's significant differences in the way that Israel relates itself, both to their God, and also the way that they understand themselves and being created, the way they understand the world as being created as only one deity, without rival, without a war, without procreative activities. And so again, with the stories that they're telling, they're trying to tell something very specific about God, that these are theological documents that they're composing as they're reflecting on the world, or reflecting on God. And especially if you look at possible time periods when this is being composed, if you're looking at it from exile, as you guys remember from Biblit, how exile has a radical impact on the people that were sent into exile, that as they're composing or compiling these things and retelling and putting down their stories onto, we'll say, paper, as they're putting these things down, then it becomes very formative for them to not only know that their God is the one who created the world, but he's the one who creates, liberates, the same one who liberates, creates. And we always go back to that. Again, that as these people are reflecting on the God who creates and who's going to continue to create for himself and to continue to create a people for himself, that's what they're looking to, and that's what they're reminding themselves of in reflecting on the past. And so again, so you look at it the known history of the ancient Near East. If we're looking at the slides, but demythologized, critiqued by revelation of God of the Exodus and the exile. So again, when we say demythologize, it doesn't necessarily mean to remove the element of the divine, because when we say demythologize, it usually means to take away some of the, if you think, take away some of the magic. But again, that's not what this is getting at. That mythology fundamentally is a way of telling stories, ancient stories, of how do you tell the beginning. And so and I brought this up before, but when we talk about mythology, usually we think like Hercules. We usually think in terms of like Midas. We usually think of Atlas carrying the world on his shoulders. You usually think of Sisyphus or Narcissus, all these old ancient myths that kind of help tell a story of how things got to be. And so that being said, that the way mythology is being done in the Old Testament, again, is the way of telling the stories, telling their beginnings. And so when we talk about it being demythologized, that again, it's being critiqued by this revelation of the God of the Exodus, who's presented himself and who's given his name over as Yahweh and revealed himself, and how that changes Israel's understanding both of themselves and the world and the relationship with God. Everything I just brought up before. And so you can go ahead and go to the next slide, Genesis 12 through 50, that patriarchal narrative. The stories of the fathers or ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their household. And that they're told in a way that mirrors the themes of Genesis 1 through 11, but they're told in light of the events of the Israelite history. So again, that you do have some things that are brought up specifically with Yahweh being creator. And I brought this up before too. Again, that Yahweh creates in Genesis 1 and 2, creates without rival, creates without procreation. And then in Genesis 12, we have somebody who comes on the scene with Abraham and with Sarai, Abram at that point, and Sarai, that you have Sarai who's barren. And again, it's not that there's no parts there to work with, but that rather God is able to create life from kind of the, if we want to put it this way, from the kind of chaos. We talked about in Genesis 1 how the Tehom is representative of chaos, and how again that from the kind of disordered pieces that that keeps one from being able to procreate, that the parts are there, but maybe not necessarily working the way that they ought to. And what Yahweh does is able to give life, create life, and also create covenant with the people. And I realize that I do this every time I leave the music running. I think. So anyway, that being said, that what Yahweh's doing there again is continuing from Genesis 1 through chapter 11, and continuing on that narrative of Yahweh as creator, that is working in conjunction and partnership with these humans to bring about his purposes. So we saw a relationship between Yahweh, Adam, and Eve in Genesis 3, or Genesis 1 through 3. It's going to change in 3. In 4, it's going to take a different look, and then we see the whole thing fall apart in chapter 6. And then Yahweh's going to, again, start over with Noah. And then Yahweh starts over again with Abraham. And so this continuing kind of restart of Yahweh working with humanity finds a definitive starting line with Abraham, in that Yahweh's commitment to Abraham by a series of covenants then really starts to put the story on a trajectory towards Israel's development and their understanding. Again, Abraham seen as a father of faith, specifically in regards to circumcision and those kinds of things, not those kinds of things, circumcision specifically. But it's in that mode of seeing Yahweh create and then also work with the humans that will then take us moving forward, especially as we go through to the Exodus. So Yahweh who creates and also covenants himself with these humans to bring about his purposes, which again finds ahead in Exodus. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see kind of a broad overview of Exodus. Let me go ahead and grab something really quick. Yeah. All right, so Exodus. Are there any questions, comments, concerns? Like saying a lot of this is pretty. It's going to be broad, but then again, likely not going to contain a lot of new information, but it will be good to re-rehearse as we go and prepare for the final, which we'll send out that question soon. Questions, comments, concerns? All right, so let me do this really quick though, because we had talked about this in class. I do want to bring it up again for you all. Let me share this. All right, there you go. Video. All right, so we do have this. So we have, especially in Genesis, we're going to have 3 covenants. One of them is going to be creation serves as a kind of covenant, even though it's not definitive. So this one is obviously this one's going to be more related to Yahweh. It's assumed it's a covenant between Yahweh and creation. It's not necessarily overt, like God's going to say, I am now covenanting with you. The other one we have is Noahic covenant, which that one is going to be God. I'll put it there, not destroying. God not, put it this way. Yahweh not using creation against itself. Or the other way we can put it is God not using creation to destroy. You can put it that way. Not using creation to destroy. So again, because what we do see in Genesis 9 is Yahweh putting down with the rainbow in the sky, putting down his bow, which at that point, God using creation against itself to hit the restart button, which obviously, again, that when we see in the story that Yahweh is not wanting to do that again, with him relenting from his, he's going to now wrestle and struggle with humans, and that's going to mark a different standpoint, which brings us to Abrahamic covenant. And this specifically, we hadn't mentioned it here, but this is going to be the guarantee. It's going to be specifically with descendants, land, and relationship. I can't type today. The way we had put it in other classes specifically is going to be people, a good way to remember it. You know, remember this, anybody who took me for Biblit, we hammered this 1,000 times. People, place, and presence. And so by the time we get to Exodus, Yahweh's going to cut another covenant. But this one, again, is going to take place in Exodus. And so we'll talk about some of that, and we kind of went through it a pretty good amount, and I'll come back to this, but specifically in Exodus, we're going to have, oh, we're moving there. Okay. That the narrative of Israel's departure from Egypt, that God doesn't speak or is identified until the end of chapter 2, which chapter 1 for the bulk of it, and even the bulk of chapter 2 is going to set up for us this cataclysmic event that's happened to Israel during their time of being in Egypt. That Joseph, who had got them to Egypt by way of being the second in command for Pharaoh, and then bringing over his family. You guys will remember that narrative where Joseph plays a trick on his brothers and holds Benjamin hostage, for lack of a better word, kind of holds him hostage until he gets to see everyone else. And so once he finally kind of reveals who he is, everybody grieves, everybody's happy, they're crying and reunited, and that's how Israel goes down to Egypt. But they're down in Egypt for about I believe it's 400 years. And so, with the time being down there, that they're experiencing large amounts of oppression. And so, this rehearsal of events that happens with oppressive activities then causes them to cry out. And at that point, we don't know necessarily. Um, we don't know from specifically the narrative itself of, again, why just at this one time that it happens, but what we do have is that we have a character named Moses who's born. And Moses, whose name, and again we talked about this, whose name himself means to draw out, will then serve to draw out Israel from the land of Egypt, which again through water. That just as Moses was drawn up out of the water, so Yahweh will draw out or pluck out Israel out of Egypt through water as well. And so again, these kind of rescue narratives that's going to serve later on as a kind of prototype for Yahweh's rescuing activities that will guide Israel in their understanding both of themselves and their relationship with Yahweh as one who redeems and creates covenant. And so we'll talk about that. So narrative departure, 1 through 15, and then Exodus 1 through 19, the wilderness narratives of divine provision. Oh, what we're doing here. Okay, there you go. And then the next section is covenantal response to rescue. And so you have Yahweh who redeems Israel and then creates a covenant. And I've brought this up before, but I'll bring it up to you again. That this will mark a way and hopefully a shift in our understanding, especially of the way. Oh, that was the wrong one. A shift in our understanding of the way we understand how grace and law function, because especially for Israel and their understanding that they weren't demanded to do something before they were recipients of grace. That it wasn't that they had to perform and then Yahweh would rescue them, but rather Yahweh first rescues and then establishes covenant for them. And the way you usually bring this up is that grace comes before law. Grace comes before law. So what we see in the Mosaic covenant specifically, again detailed, is how the people are going to live in their new covenant relationship with Yahweh. And so again, both the demands of the covenant with not having foreign deities, which we'll get. And I do need to underscore that this covenant relationship, that this part here. Jeez. First let me widen this so it'll stop giving me so many troubles. Covenant relationship. So because then all these that no other gods, no graven images, that these what they're going to relate back to. They're going to relate back this kind of single-hearted devotion. And I brought that up before in Deuteronomy and then again in Exodus, that what these two are going to suggest specifically comes down to this kind of single-hearted devotion to Yahweh, which you find out that Israel will have a very difficult time dealing with. But again, it's because of what Yahweh has done for the people. What Yahweh's done for the people in order to establish relationship with himself, that he gives freely of grace and rescues and redeems them. And now the covenant, or what's stated as a contract or the guarantee, is that the people will now be devoted to Yahweh in response to this grace. And so again, that continued response, which will then look like single-hearted devotion to Yahweh, but then also as you have numerated there afterwards, not numerated, but you have other laws after, with no stealing, no killing, you're not going to covet your neighbor's stuff, no adultery, observe the Sabbath. So these kinds of things which are meant to help humans live in relationship with one another. And though Sabbath does function a little differently in Exodus than it does in Deuteronomy, again, the intention is that their loyalty to Yahweh was meant to transform their human relationships, which then would be a light to the nations. But again, here it first takes its form that it's this guide for Israel to understand their relationship with Yahweh and the relationship with one another. It always goes back to that Yahweh's grace is revealed to the people in the Exodus in order to help them to understand who Yahweh is, and then how to help them to be able to form their relationships with one another and how to participate in this community as this covenanting people that live differently than other nations because of, again, their service to Yahweh and their servitude to, specifically their servitude to Yahweh. Sorry, I'm have like 4 screens open, so I'm trying to get them all lined up. There we go. Are there any questions so far? Okay, so you'll see there on the slide, the Sinai Covenant and Law Code, Tabernacle instructions. You have the departure there, the golden calf incident in the middle between 31 and 34, and then tabernacle implementation. And so we had talked about, again, in class, where it's Yahweh moving in with the people, that this idea, this vision in Genesis 1 and 2 of Yahweh dwelling with and among the people has kind of found its partial restoration in this event, where Yahweh, who's in the tabernacle, now dwelling in and among the people, but there's very specific requirements for how the people are to be in relationship with Yahweh, which again, part of it is the learning device and the teaching device for the humans to understand that Yahweh is fundamentally different than not just the humans, but then also the deities that are around in the area. And so even with the instructions that Yahweh is giving, that's also a sign of grace, that Yahweh is willing to work with and teach the humans how to participate in their new life with him. Which ultimately, that's what Leviticus is all about, which we're going to move over to Leviticus now. Leviticus is divided by genre into 7 major units, which goes back and forth between law and narrative. Leviticus goes back and forth between law and narratives, and the narratives themselves are going to allude to one another, and the structural indicators for developing thought of the legal sections. Those deal consecutively with sacrifices, cleanness, holiness, and redemption. So again, they're going to go back and forth, which is why sometimes you'll find you'll find the story about Aaron's sons offering strange fire, and then you'll have then deal with sacrificial systems, and then cleanness, and then holiness later on. And that's why it usually doesn't just kind of read cleanly, especially because Leviticus isn't detached from the time period that Leviticus is. The setting for it is within the time period between the tabernacle going up of Exodus and then them starting the journey in Numbers. And so if you were kind of having, I have 2 pens here. So if you have kind of like Exodus as a black pen, Numbers as a green one, that kind of put these 2 together, that my fingers would kind of be Leviticus. It's happening during that same time period. And so, again, that the people are figuring out what the relationship with Yahweh is going to look like. That Yahweh's not leaving them to their own devices, and that Yahweh's working with the humans to help them understand how this relationship is going to move forward and how it's going to be maintained. And so the Hebrews have to be taught, and they have to be guided on how to worship, how to serve Yahweh, how they're going to go about in the relationship with him, how they're going to go about functioning, even just as a community, to maintain basic sanitation, which is why people are put outside of the area inside of the encampment in order for cleanness, and they can't eat certain things because, as we come to find out, that they have to have very specific ways of being cooked, and that if they're not cooked a specific way, then it causes major issues. You can get very sick, which again, where we're finding ourselves now. And so again, that this is meant to be an extension of grace, and it's not just demanding legalism. That this is meant to be grace, that the people are being taught on how they're supposed to serve, and how, even more than that, how they're supposed to love Yahweh with everything, including what they do with their daily activities. And so that takes us over to Numbers. The Numbers usually is divided up into 3 sections, geographic, that you have in the first section of Numbers 1 through 10, the wilderness of Sinai, and then you have that second part of Numbers 10 through 11, from Sinai to Kadesh, and the third part goes from chapter 22 to 36, the steeps of Moab. The steeps of Moab. So again, Numbers is the book of the people on a move. That they're the people that are wandering through the wilderness and moving from Egypt to the promised land, and it's also the book that is going to make for some problems, especially for Israel. And so you can go over a couple times, but what I do want you to look at this point, if you look over that chiasmus, and you could zoom in a little bit just kind of by clicking in and then going in on it. But so chiasmus, I've talked about this before, but I'll spend a couple minutes on this. I won't take too long. So chiasmus, chiasm, that chi in Greek equals x. And so it's going to kind of follow an A, B, we'll put C, and then you kind of have a C prime, B, A format. And that's what a chiasm is going to look like. Again, these kind of repeated parts. Some Psalms do this. Bless the Lord, for he has done great things. He's delivered my soul from the pit of death. From the pit of death, he has redeemed me. Bless the Lord. And so that's how a chiasm would work, and going back and forth again. You have repeated lines, but what's most important is going to be this section right here in the middle. These 2 lines of what the middle, the kind of guts of the entire structure is going to be, that because he's redeemed me, and then these 2 out here. So again, what's at the middle is going to be what's most important. And you guys maybe covered a little bit in BLE, but definitely for practicum, this will come back again. And so as we're looking at this chiasm, what I do want you to take notice of, especially as we work through Numbers, to see here, let me see if I can zoom, there we go, that in this entire structure, that you have in the middle and around the middle, that Aaron, the story, where are you going? With the story with Aaron and his sons bearing the guilt, and the red heifer and ashes to cleanse the people, and around that, this kind of rebellion story. That rebellion at the heart of Numbers, which again, sadly enough, that's what Numbers often includes, is as things go from bad to worse, and this is just one way to, what's it doing now? No, I just missed it. Let me get over there again. There you go. So there we go. So as the story starts moving forward, that we do see the rebellion kind of seeping in farther and farther from the people, concentrically inward to Aaron and Miriam, and then Korah and the sons, and then Aaron and Miriam, and then Moses. The kind of final straw of where people, of who's now no longer permitted to go into the promised land. And so the only two permitted into the promised land from there are going to be Joshua and Caleb. But again, as Numbers tells its own story of what it's trying to tell, that the wilderness isn't a kind place, the wilderness isn't a safe place, but it's a place where God is at. That the wilderness is a place where God is at, and what the wilderness then starts to take the form of that of a place of testing. That the wilderness is a place of testing. And again, if we think that this is, if the people who are in exile are compiling and telling these stories, it starts to make perfect sense of them quite possibly feeling like this is part of the test that we are now in, that this kind of place where God seems to not be at, this place where it doesn't make a lot of sense. It's a place of confusion. It's a place of being disoriented. Yet at the same time, it's a place where God is shaping, informing, challenging, and testing. And what's being proven through this, again, is Israel's loyalty of whether or not they're going to be faithful to Yahweh and keep their commitments, or whether they're going to choose something else. And sadly, for those in Numbers, that their faithfulness or their loyalty is devoted to someone else, which why that repeated refrain of wanting to go back to Pharaoh starts having more and more effect, because of the fact that these people are now wanting nothing to do with Yahweh. They want to go back to their former king, their former life with Pharaoh. And so, again, that's going to cause some issues. And so Yahweh, in answer to their own prayer, their own desire, the people die in the wilderness as a result. And so Yahweh has to start over with a new community, with a new generation, which finds itself in Deuteronomy. If you want to go over to the next slide. Deuteronomy, the Yahweh is starting with a new people who must renew their vows to the covenant if they continue as God's people. The Yahweh is starting with a new people who must renew their vows to the covenant if they're to continue as Yahweh's people. I'll go ahead and put that on here for you guys to see. Sorry, that was my brother. Let me expand this for you guys. So Yahweh is starting with a new people who must renew their vows to the covenant, and this one specifically, Mosaic covenant, if they are to be and continue as God's people. And so that's what, again, what makes Deuteronomy significant, and talked with last class of Deuteros in Greek means two, Namas in law. So Deuteronomy then would be second law, or second giving of the law. So with the second giving of the law, that Yahweh's starting over with the new generation in the hopes, the desire that they will prove more faithful than the first, but it's not guaranteed. And so you have the breakdowns of the specific laws and the way that they'll work out. That you have the prologue, this kind of introduction of the parties. And I'll go ahead. I'll put this again up on the document and share it with you guys so you guys can see it. Though with the way mine's a little more detailed of what I have there. So you have the prologue, the introduction of the parties, which again looks like an ancient Near Eastern treaty. You have these people who are in a context that are assuming a covenant, of which would have been, may have been not, it would have been common to create in the ancient Near East. Again, with the creation of a covenant, that what you have is these two covenanting parties that are now guaranteeing from both sides. But you start off with the introduction. The essence of the law is that general instruction, the kind of bulk, the content of them, which we talked about a couple weeks ago with specifically Genesis chapter 6 and loving the Lord, and then what that looks like. You have the core laws of the bulk of, again, what is it going to mean? What is it going to look like after the essence? What is it going to look like? What do they got to do? What do they not do? Then you have I need to bring this up because usually, especially in Pentecostal churches, um, especially that this would get brought up with curses and blessings. Mind you, look at the way that it's being drawn out and where it follows. Like, it's not just arbitrary, put in arbitrarily, and it doesn't just follow like haphazardly or willy-nilly, but that it follows the essence of the law and the core laws, the teachings, Torah, and then curses and blessings. That it doesn't come before. And I need to bring that up because of the fact that usually when we talk about these kinds of things with like generational curses and stuff like that, it's in response to the core laws and the essence of the laws. And that what it's meant to do is serve as a kind of encouragement, or warning, if you want to think about it that way as well, towards keeping Torah. That blessings and curses serve as an encouragement towards keeping Torah. It's not just arbitrarily given because your grandma or your mom had a kid out of wedlock, and now you're forced or going to be now having to live under that penalty or whatever it might be. I've heard that over and over again in the churches I've been a part of. That the sins that your parents commit can fall down back on you, or your family's under a curse because of something your grandma did 30, 45, or 40, 50 years ago. But again, that kind of thought goes back to this, that once somebody's done something, that there's a curse that then exists, which again, that's more in regards to superstition than it is taking the Old Testament seriously. Because again, all this is under the restrictions and under the guise that of this covenant that Yahweh is creating with the people. Does that make sense? Yay, nay? There we go. We got a thumbs up. Good. Yeah. So again, especially, and you guys may very well hear this come up again and again, especially with the blessing coming up more often, and that's taken out of Numbers, that Levitical blessing on the people. I'm talking about specifically the song, but that comes out of Numbers. But I'm not going to doubt it's going to be like, I'm not going to doubt it's going to come up again later on, especially as it goes with blessings and curses. But to understand first that this is in the context of Mosaic covenant, and those of you that have taken BLE, that you'll know that again, that's one of the things that that Paul is trying to work with specifically in Galatians, is specifically with covenant, and then more specifically Abrahamic covenant, but with covenant keeping in general, of what does that then look like for those that are part of God's people, who aren't under the covenant. And that's, again, we're not Jewish unless you are, which you may very well be, but again, us being Gentiles, what does that then look like for us, which is again then going to be different. So it's really important to know, and I don't just say it again to bash anybody, but it's important for us to consider the context always in the Bible, to first be responsible and then to be faithful. And so again, that being said, that's where that part comes in. And I did need to say it because again, I usually don't I hadn't brought it up before, but I realized it's a good time to bring it up. So go over to the next section, where Deuteronomy is a series of 3 speeches made by Moses, but the whole book follows the structure of an ancient Near Eastern treaty. The Deuteronomy is a series of 3 speeches, but it also follows the structure of an ancient Near Eastern treaty, which genius work. And so it's important for us to remember that these people don't exist in a vacuum, but that they also don't borrow wholesale from their neighbors, from other cultures. And so if you go over to the next section, Are there any questions so far? We're going to be wrapping up here pretty soon. Are there any questions, comments, concerns? No, this will be like the second to last Zoom call with Partita, so it's a historic moment. All right. Here to answer here to answer advice, to give advice, wisdom, foolishness, all of it. All right. So we'll go through a brief history of Israel if you have no comments, questions, concerns. So let me go ahead and share this with you guys as well. There you go. So if you guys are on this slide here, and I don't know why it keeps doing that, but this brief history of Israel. So post Exodus, this is going to be after the Exodus, obviously, when after Deuteronomy, after Joshua, destruction of many Canaanite towns, Israelites into Canaan. So this is going to be during Joshua Judges period. Hebrew tribes settle in Canaan, and then Saul reigns as a first king. So this is pretty much going to take us from Joshua through First Samuel. An establishment, David captures Jerusalem, which again, that's kind of the second part of First Samuel, taking us through the prophets. Solomon is king in Israel. Solomon builds the temple. Israel, let's just go down. No. Okay. Solomon's king of Israel. Solomon builds the first temple of Jerusalem. And just a side note, this isn't going to show up on the final, but this is going to be good to know. Again, for as you guys go into Kings and Prophets, as you guys are going through, even for synoptics, it's going to be good to know these things, because again, the gospel writers will pull on some of these things in the past, especially with Jesus as being a kind of second Moses, and yeah, it'll come back. It all comes back around, and Jesus being king and stuff. So so Solomon builds the first temple of Jerusalem, and especially with that temple building, it's kind of pinnacle moment where Yahweh's with his people in a specific place and in a location. Again, the tabernacle that was temporary, this kind of housing for Yahweh to be with the people, now finds its pinnacle moment. People, place, presence, all right there. They're there. They're in the promised land. God's people surrounding the temple, the presence of God. They're in that temple, filling the temple. That is kind of, it's finally, the dream's been realized. The dream's been fulfilled. And so Israel is going to pay tribute to Syria, but of course the dream has to come with some nuances. It's not necessarily going to be just all rainbows and gumdrops. And you have the conquest of Israel. Israel is going to be conquered by Assyria. King Sennacherib of Syria is going to sack the city of Lachish, but fails to take the capital of Jerusalem. And then post-exile, Babylon captures. So we talked about this in Biblit, that Israel, the north, gets taken over by Syria. Judah, the south, gets taken over by Babylon. So Babylonian king captures Jerusalem. Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians, the fall of Babylon, conquered by Cyrus of Persia, and the return of the Jews, and the beginning of Second Temple Judaism right around 516. And so I'll kind of let you guys in behind the curtains a little bit. This is when most scholars think that the Old Testament was compiled in the form that we have now. Right around here, right around this time period. So whether it be in the 10, likely sometime between 97 to 39, where a lot of it, again, it's not just the writing, but it's the compilation, the bringing together of the Old Testament as a whole. So, and now we start seeing why it's so formative, because of so much of the destruction that's happening to the people and all that they're experiencing. So, are there any questions, comments, concerns? Everybody good? All right, there you go. Another thumbs up. So, all right. Well, if you guys are good, and just a quick note that the reason why I had brought up that last little bit, that it's important to know, especially for these people as they're reflecting on Yahweh being creator and Yahweh being the only God, the supreme God, that as they're in a foreign place like Babylon, where there's lots of, where there's rival deities, that they're in a place of a rival deity, um, that what kind of statements are they making? What kind of pledges of faith are they making? What stories are helping shape their imagination? And what stories are meant to encourage their own faith and faithfulness in a land of chaos, Babel? And so that they're reminding themselves of Yahweh as creator. They're reminding themselves of Yahweh as liberator. They're reminding themselves of Yahweh as a supreme God. They're reminding themselves of the people that they were meant to be. And then rehearsing these stories as people of the book, as people who are formed and shaped by stories in a land where their identity is stripped away from them. And so again, that it was important enough for them to have remembered these stories and to have them written down in order to both learn from and also to shape their identities, which sounds a whole lot like what the New Testament is trying to do for us as well. And what Paul encourages those in 1 Corinthians 10 to do as well is to learn from their stories and to learn and to rehearse both who God is and what who we're meant to be and what direction we're to go, especially as we're walking this often weird, strange, new, wonderful, crazy road that it is to be a follower of Jesus. And so, again, for us that are often in those kinds of places where it is chaotic and it's messy and can't tell up from down or from south, of learning what does it mean to be God's people and also learning who God is in the process of that. And the thing that comes up over again and again in the Old Testament is that Yahweh's present with his people. In the middle of rebellion, in the middle of worship, in the middle of the beauty and the chaos, that God's there. That God makes himself known to the people and the struggling with the people and the wrestling with the people, and that Yahweh, he doesn't give up. He doesn't give up on the people no matter how messy, no matter how chaotic, no matter how great it's going. And that, yeah, that doesn't change Yahweh's decision to commit himself to a people and to keep himself from having a people for himself. And so hopefully that's an encouragement for you, again, as you're going throughout this week and for the next week, that what the Bible is meant to do, again, is to offer us wisdom and to offer us an encouragement, this word from God that lets us know both who we are, who God is, and who God will continue to be as we continue to follow and to trust him, as we continue to be loyal and devoted creatures who love God and love people. Know how do we go about living in this world? So if you have no, I'll give any comments, questions, or anything. All right. Well, if there's none, then you guys are good to go. I will post this up on Moodle later. There you go. Another thumbs up. I will post this up on Moodle later on if there's something that you missed or something you want to know. So, love you guys. Miss you guys. Hope you guys have a great week. If you guys need anything, email me, and we'll set up another one of these Zoom calls or set up an email or something. So, yeah, just get into contact and let me know. You guys have a great week. See you guys.
Thank you, Professor.
Of course, man. You're welcome. Bye.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.